Welcome to Haunted Whispers, where the eerie unknown come to life through spine-chilling stories. Our channel dives into the depths of horror, blending suspenseful narratives with vivid storytelling that will keep you on edge. From ghostly apparitions to haunted roads, each tale is crafted to stir your imagination and send shivers down your spine. Whether you're a fan of the supernatural, urban legends, or psychological thrillers, there's something here to captivate every horror enthusiast. Subscribe now and join us in exploring the shadows, where fear meets fiction. Let us start the story of Echoes of the Forgotten. Firstly, we will discuss about arrival at St. Augustine Asylum. The van rumbled down a winding, overgrown road, its headlights slicing through the dense fog. The road was barely visible, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in with every mile. Inside the van, the team of four sat in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the night ahead. St. Augustine Asylum loomed in their minds like a dark shadow, a relic of a sinister past that refused to fade. Mota? We're almost there, Ashley announced from the driver's seat, her voice calm but laced with the weight of what was to come. The team leader had navigated countless haunted locations before, but something about this asylum unsettled even her. The stories she had read while researching this investigation still lingered in her mind. Patients subjected to barbaric treatments, staff who vanished without a trace, and rumors of a malevolent presence that had kept Villain abandoned for decades. In the passenger seat, Jake adjusted his equipment bag. His fingers nervously tapped against the dashboard as he ran through a mental checklist of their gear. Cameras, EVP recorders, thermal imaging sensors, and motion detectors. As the tech expert of the team, Jake's confidence lay in the tangibles, data, recordings, and measurable proof of the paranormal. He often joked that he didn't believe in ghosts until they were caught on camera, but his hands betrayed his unease tonight. "I'm pretty sure it's a ghost," Rachel laughed, and then her voice became elated. That bad, right?" Jake asked the tech expert. "On the street, this place is a gold mine for content," Ben chimed in from the back seat, his voice breaking the silence. The youngest member of the team, Ben had joined just a few months ago, eager to prove himself. His wide-eyed excitement was a stark contrast to the grim expressions of his colleagues. "Do you realize how many views this episode is going to get? St. Augustine Asylum is legendary." Sorry, Issam said. Ashley shot him a look through the rearview mirror, her lips tightening. "Legendary for a reason, Ben. This isn't just about views. Places like this can be dangerous, physically and spiritually. Keep your head on straight." Ben nodded, but the nervous smile remained plastered on his face. He glanced at Clara, who sat beside him, her eyes closed and her breathing steady. The medium of the group, Clara had been quiet since they started the journey, her usual friendly demeanor replaced by an unsettling stillness. She often prepared herself mentally before an investigation, claiming it helped her connect to the energies of the location. "I suspect we're finally ready, Ben. What creature you got for me?" Tonight, though, her silence felt different. "Are you okay, Clara?" Ben asked hesitantly. Clara opened her eyes slowly and turned to him, her gaze heavy with something he couldn't quite place. "There's a weight here," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's like the air gets thicker the closer we get. It's not, welcoming." Ben swallowed hard and looked out the window, trying to dismiss the growing unease in the pit of his stomach. "Oh." The van rounded a final bend, and there it was. St. Augustine Asylum stood like a giant corpse against the night sky, its jagged silhouette framed by the pale light of the moon. The building was massive, its facade crumbling with age. Ivy crawled up its stone walls like veins on a decaying body, and shattered windows gaped like empty sockets. The once grand entrance was now a hollow archway, its wooden doors long gone. "Holy shit," Jake muttered, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine awe. "This place looks like it came straight out of a horror movie." Ashley pulled the van into a clearing and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. She turned to the group, her tone firm. Remember the plan. Jake, set up the base camp in the lobby. Clara, take a moment to ground yourself before we start. Ben, stick with me. Don't wander off. This place is a maze, and we don't need anyone getting lost. I guess I got naked and angry. The group nodded, their earlier chatter replaced by a tense focus. They grabbed their gear and stepped out into the cold night. The air was damp, carrying the scent of moss and decay. As they approached the asylum, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoed unnaturally, as though the building itself were listening. Before embarking on this investigation, the team had stopped in the nearby town for supplies and to gather information. The reaction of the locals had been unanimous. Fear. The water releases had been overcome, but the table had withstood the consequences, leaving Dennison's legs unbraced. I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not a racist, said Dennison Walm. You're heading to St. Augustine? The gas station attendant had asked, his eyes widening. That place is cursed. People who go there don't come back the same. An elderly woman sitting in the corner of the store had chimed in, her voice trembling. The doctor, he's still there, you know. Dr. Albright, they say he never left. That's why no one dares go near the place. Despite the ominous warnings, the team pressed on. For Ashley, it wasn't about proving the skeptics wrong or satisfying the believers. It was about uncovering the truth. The group stood at the entrance, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The beam of Ashley's light landed on a tarnished plaque beside the archway where it was written, "With due care, give safety." An Augustine Asylum for the Mentally Ill, established 1923, closed 1968. Here we go, Ashley said, pushing down the shiver that ran through her spine. She stepped inside, followed closely by the others. The lobby was vast and eerily empty, with high ceilings that amplified every sound. The remnants of grandeur were still visible in the marble floor, now cracked and coated in dust. A massive chandelier hung precariously, its crystals clinking faintly in the breeze. Jake set up the base camp quickly, arranging their monitors and equipment on an old reception desk. We've got signal, he reported, checking the feeds from the cameras they'd placed outside. Let's hope it stays that way. Clara wandered a few steps ahead, her hand brushing the peeling wallpaper. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. They're watching us, she murmured. Ben, who had been nervously fidgeting with his flashlight, froze. Who's watching us? He asked, his voice cracking. Clara didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Ashley. We shouldn't have come here, she said. We shouldn't have come here. We'll be fine, Ashley said, more to herself than anyone else. Stick to the plan, and we'll be out of here before sunrise. The team's mission was clear. Document any signs of paranormal activity to share with their growing online audience. Their previous episodes had been met with skepticism, but Ashley was determined to change that. St. Augustine Asylum, with its notorious reputation, was the perfect opportunity to capture undeniable evidence. Everyone says this about the ATs in those early 90s, but this is the big one, Jake had said during their planning meeting. If we can prove something's here, we'll go viral. No more amateur status, we'll be the real deal. But as they stood in the shadowy depths of the asylum, the thrill of the hunt was quickly replaced by a gnawing dread. The building felt alive, as though it were aware of their presence. As the group prepared to venture deeper into the asylum, a faint noise echoed through the lobby, a soft rhythmic tapping. They froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. And with the sound came... Did you hear that? Ben whispered, his grip tightening on his flashlight. It's probably just the wind, Ashley said, though her voice lacked conviction. But Clara shook her head, her eyes wide. No, she said. It's not the wind, it's them. And so the investigation began, with the team stepping into the heart of the asylum, unaware of the horrors that awaited them in the dark. Now, we will know about arrival at St. Augustine Asylum. The van rolled to a stop, its headlights dimming against the dense fog that cloaked the area like a shroud. Before them stood St. Augustine Asylum, a monolithic structure that seemed to defy the passage of time. Its jagged silhouette was carved into the night sky, a dark testament to the horrors it had witnessed. The asylum was a haunting relic of the past, its grandeur long since decayed. Shattered windows lined its facade like empty, accusing eyes. Rusted iron gates hung open, creaking faintly in the wind, their twisted bars unable to keep out the encroaching ivy that climbed relentlessly up the stone walls. The heavy air carried the mingled sense of damp earth and decay, adding an almost tangible weight to the team's growing unease. However, the hotel's great white porches sat monstrous in the haunted dark of the night. "This place is something else," Jake muttered, stepping out of the van. He adjusted his camera strap, his eyes scanning the looming structure. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it. Ashley stood beside him, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. "We've dealt with creepy before," she said, her voice steady. "Stick to the plan, and we'll be fine." Ben, the youngest of the group, craned his neck to take in the building's towering height. "How long has it been abandoned?" he asked, his voice tinged with both awe and trepidation. "Since the late 60s, Ashley replied. "But the stories go back much further." She turned to Clara, who lingered a few steps behind, staring at the asylum with an unreadable expression. "What are you picking up?" asked Jane. Clara shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's heavy," she murmured. "The air feels charged, like the building itself is alive." The group approached the asylum cautiously, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The massive wooden doors that once marked the entrance were gone, leaving a yawning black void. The threshold seemed to breathe, exhaling a chill that made Ben hesitate. "Come on," Ashley urged, motioning him forward. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, thick with the smell of ether and something far worse, rot. The lobby stretched before them, its grandeur reduced to rubble. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated in decades of grime. Crumbling plaster littered the floor, and the walls bore faded graffiti, messages of warning, despair, and the occasional crude drawing. Jake set down his equipment and began setting up a stationary camera. "Let's get a baseline reading," he said, powering up the EMF detector. The device beeped faintly, its needle twitching erratically. Jake frowned. "This thing's acting weird. Might be interference." Ashley glanced at him. "Or it's starting already," she said. As the group moved deeper into the asylum, the flickering beam of their flashlights revealed more unsettling details. Rusted hospital beds lay overturned in the hallways, their wheels squeaking faintly, as if moved by an unseen hand. Broken equipment was scattered everywhere. IV poles, cracked monitors, and syringes still glinting faintly in the dim light. Clara paused, running her fingers along a peeling wall. She recoiled suddenly, as if burned. "There's something here," she whispered. "It's not just memories, it's, watching us." Ben's flashlight sputtered, plunging his corner of the room into momentary darkness. Guys," he called nervously, "is this place supposed to mess with electronics?" Jake shrugged, though his expression was tense. "Old buildings can have electromagnetic fields. But this is, unusual." A sudden sound cut through the silence, a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from above. The group froze, their eyes darting upward. "It's probably just debris," Ashley said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. But as they listened, the sound grew louder, morphing into the unmistakable echo of footsteps. "We're supposed to be alone, right?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. Jake nodded, glancing at the monitors he had just set up. "No movement outside. It's just us." The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. A faint whisper followed, almost imperceptible, but enough to send chills down their spines. Everyone in the room stared at the footsteps. Ryder, uttering a wordless whisper of amazement, passed the 5 men down the walkway. Did you hear that? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ashley nodded. Stay close. Let's keep moving. As they entered what appeared to be a treatment room, Jake's thermal camera began to glitch, its screen flickering wildly. Damn it, he muttered, smacking the device lightly. What's wrong? Ashley asked, peering over his shoulder. It's showing anomalies. Heat signatures where there shouldn't be any. Could be a malfunction, but... Jake trailed off, his eyes narrowing at the screen. The room was ice cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Yet, the camera registered patches of heat in the shape of handprints, as though someone or something had recently touched the walls. Halfway through, Clara staggered suddenly, clutching her head. They're here, she said, her voice strained. They don't want us here. Ben backed toward the door, his face pale. Maybe we shouldn't be here. Ashley stepped forward, her jaw set. We're not turning back now. Let's find out what they want. The asylum seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its decayed halls alive with whispers of the past. For the team, the night had only begun, but St. Augustine Asylum was already making its presence known. They had come in search of ghosts, but it was becoming clear that the ghosts had been waiting for them. Now we will discuss about the asylum's dark history. The team gathered in what appeared to have been the asylum's administrative office. Dust-coated filing cabinets stood against the walls, their drawers either jammed shut or hanging open to reveal yellowed papers spilling onto the floor. A massive desk occupied the center of the room, its surface littered with objects that spoke of the asylum's grim past. Oh, yeah, there's a small desk in the back. Can we drop anything off and we can talk? Whoa, it's been so long. It's been a while. It's just coated, nail polish. Ashley picked up the journal and carefully opened it, the brittle pages crackling under her touch. The entries were written in neat but hurried handwriting, each line more disturbing than the last. It was written there... May 12, 1954. Patient 245 exhibited extreme resistance to treatment today. Administered maximum dosage of sedative before proceeding with electroshock therapy. No improvement noted. Must increase intensity. Her stomach churned as she read further. Descriptions of experimental procedures filled the pages. Unsanctioned treatments that bordered on torture. The author seemed to view the patients not as people, but as subjects, to be broken and rebuilt. This is sick, Ben muttered, peering over her shoulder. Didn't anyone try to stop them? Ashley shook her head. Back then, asylums like this were out of sight, out of mind. Nobody cared what went on inside. Jake rummaged through the cabinets, pulling out old photographs bound together with a crumbling rubber band. He spread them across the desk, and the team leaned in for a closer look. The images were stark black and white, each one capturing a moment of agony frozen in time. Emaciated patients sat in rows on benches, their hollow eyes staring into the camera. Nurses with forced smiles stood beside machines that looked more like instruments of torture than medical equipment. In one photograph, a stern-looking doctor loomed over a strapped-down patient, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Jake turned the photograph over and read the names scrawled on the back. Dr. Elias Monroe. At the bottom of a drawer, Jake discovered a stack of old newspaper clippings. The headlines told a chilling tale. Mass escape at St. Augustine Asylum, patients missing, doctor unaccounted for. Asylum's controversial treatments under scrutiny. Dr. Monroe vanishes without a trace amid scandal. What happened here? Clara whispered, her fingers brushing the edge of the photographs. Looks like Monroe was running some kind of horror show, Jake said. Then something went very wrong. The articles described a night when chaos erupted within the asylum. Patients, pushed to their breaking points by Monroe's cruel experiments, staged a mass escape. Blood-soaked hallways bore the evidence of their rebellion, but no bodies were ever recovered. Monroe himself disappeared that same night, leaving only rumors in his wake, rumors of his experiments continuing somewhere far more secluded. As Clara touched one of the photographs, her body stiffened and her eyes rolled back. The team froze, unsure of what was happening. "Clara, are you okay?" Ashley asked, reaching out. Clara didn't respond. Her breathing grew shallow and her face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. She suddenly collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling. "She's having a vision," Jake said, kneeling beside her. "Give her space." Clara's voice broke the silence. But it wasn't her usual tone. It was hoarse and frantic, as though channeling someone else entirely. And I sighed, crushed by a feeling. "Run, they're coming! Blood, so much blood," she screamed, clutching at the air. In her mind's eye, Clara was no longer in the office. She was back in the asylum's heyday, standing in the middle of a chaotic scene. Frantic patients ran through the halls, their hospital gowns soaked in blood. Some carried makeshift weapons, others clawed at the walls as if trying to escape an invisible torment. The air was filled with screams, high-pitched wails of pain and guttural cries of rage. Shadowy figures, obscured by an unnatural darkness, chased the patients, their movements jerky and inhuman. Clara could feel their malice, a seething hatred that seeped into every corner of the building. She turned to see Dr. Monroe, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. His hands were gloved, stained with something dark and wet. He held a clipboard, jotting down notes with eerie calm as the chaos unfolded around him. "No one leaves," Monroe said, his voice cold and detached. "This is their home now." With a gasp, Clara snapped back to reality. Her body shook as Ashley helped her sit up, and tears streamed down her face. "What did you see?" Ashley asked gently. Clara struggled to find the words. It wasn't just patients running, it was something else. Dark shapes, like shadows come to life. And Monroe, he was there, watching it all. He didn't try to stop it, he encouraged it. Monroe sighed. Ben looked visibly shaken. "This is insane. Maybe we should leave." Ashley shook her head, though her face was pale. "Not yet. If Monroe's spirit is here, he might be the key to everything. We need to keep going." As the group packed up the objects they found, the oppressive atmosphere of the asylum seemed to close in around them. The faint smell of ether grew stronger, mingling with a metallic tang that made their stomachs churn. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hall, faint but unmistakable. The team froze, their eyes locked on the doorway. "Tell me you heard that," Jake said, gripping his camera tightly. Ashley nodded, her jaw set. "We keep moving, stay close." The team exited the office, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they ventured further into the asylum. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the building itself was resisting their presence. Unbeknownst to them, they were no longer alone. The shadows seemed to shift and ripple, their movements just out of sight. The past was bleeding into the present, and the team was about to uncover more than they ever bargained for. Now we will know about unexplainable encounters. The oppressive silence within St. Augustine Asylum was occasionally broken by unexplainable noises. A faint whisper, the creak of a door, or the echo of footsteps. As the team pressed deeper into the labyrinth of decaying halls, the asylum's sinister energy began to isolate and prey upon each of them in unnerving ways. Ashley, leading the group, paused as a faint sound reached her ears. It was subtle at first, almost lost beneath the shuffle of their footsteps, but it grew clearer. A child crying. Do you hear that?" she asked, turning to the others. Jake shook his head, adjusting his camera. Ben looked uneasy, glancing around. Clara frowned, her expression distant. "It's coming from that way," Ashley whispered, pointing down a hallway. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, her flashlight casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. She came upon a small room at the end of the hall. The remnants of toys and tiny chairs lay scattered across the floor. A faded mural of cheerful animals adorned the peeling walls, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere. The crying stopped. Ashley scanned the room, her light falling on a broken rocking horse swaying slightly, though the air was still. Her chest tightened as she whispered, "Hello? Is someone here?" The response was silence, followed by the faint creak of the rocking horse, slowing to a stop. Ashley backed out of the room, shaken but unwilling to alarm the others. The pretty boys followed her around the rest of the house, and after a minute to the next one, Ashley paused. She started to undress again, her arms folded willfully and her legs curled. As the group regrouped, Jake adjusted the settings on his camera. The equipment, which had been glitching sporadically since they entered, now seemed to have a mind of its own. Yeah. I think it's helping." He held the viewfinder to his eye, panning slowly down the hallway. As he did, a flicker caught his attention, a shadow moving across the frame, independent of the group. "Guys, hold still," Jake said, his voice tense. The others froze, watching as he replayed the footage. On the tiny screen, a dark figure darted across the hallway, though no one was there in real life. "What the hell was that?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer, his jaw tight as he replayed the footage again. "It's not one of us. That thing, it's moving against the light." Wyatt gritted his teeth. "Let's get out of here, Mitmo. We can always deal with Grimes later." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear mounting. Ben trailed slightly behind the others, gripping his flashlight tightly. His nerves were fraying, and every creak and groan of the building set his heart racing. He stopped abruptly when he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was draped in a hospital gown, its posture hunched and unnatural. I paused at the door, sensing an oscillation within the patient. When I approached her, she jumped back, wincing when I was hit with a clipboard. "Hey, did anyone go ahead?" Ben called out, his voice shaking. The others turned to him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Ashley asked. Ben pointed, but the figure was gone. The hallway was empty, the shadows undisturbed. "I swear there is someone there," he insisted. Jake raised his camera to capture the area, but nothing appeared. Clara stepped closer to Ben, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not imagining things," she said softly, her eyes scanning the hallway. "But I don't think it wants us here." Clara's unease grew with every step they took. The oppressive energy was suffocating, and she could feel something malevolent following them, just out of sight. "So, perhaps it's here and there?" She stopped abruptly, clutching her head. "We have to leave," she said urgently. "It doesn't want us here. It's watching us." Ashley frowned. "Clara, we can't just—" "No," Clara snapped, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. This place, it's alive, and it's angry." The group hesitated, the weight of Clara's warning sinking in. Despite their growing fear, the team pressed on. Clara's warnings hung heavy in the air, but Ashley was determined to uncover the truth. They turned a corner and found themselves in a room that seemed eerily preserved compared to the rest of the asylum. A lone table was set for them both, and a white cloth to cover anything but writing. At the center of the room stood an operating table, its metal surface gleaming faintly in the light. The tools were neatly arranged on a tray beside it. Scalpels, clamps, and other instruments that looked disturbingly pristine, as though they had been prepared for use mere moments ago. "Why is this room so intact?" Jake asked, his voice hushed. Clara stepped back, her face pale. "This is the heart of it," she whispered. "The pain, the fear, It all started here. Ashley stepped closer to the table, her flashlight revealing dark stains on the floor beneath it. She shuddered, imagining the horrors that had taken place in this very spot. Suddenly, Jake's camera beeped, and a wave of static filled the screen. The room's atmosphere grew colder, and the faint sound of metal clinking echoed through the air. Staring down at her, a gasp crypted through Kay's limbs. She answered. Ben backed toward the door. This is bad, really bad. We need to go. Before anyone could respond, the operating table creaked, as though bearing the weight of an invisible body. The tools began to rattle, their sharp edges catching the light in a way that made everyone's skin crawl. We're not alone, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. The team's fear was palpable as they realized they had ventured too far into the asylum's darkness. The spirits of St. Augustine were no longer content to remain unseen. The group's nerves were frayed as they made their way through the asylum's labyrinthine halls. The oppressive air seemed heavier with every step, as though the building itself was watching their every move. Jake paused suddenly, frowning at his thermal camera. "Hold up," he said, gesturing for the others to stop. "I'm picking up something strange." Ashley turned to him, her flashlight illuminating his furrowed brow. "What kind of strange?" Jake pointed to the screen. The thermal camera displayed a series of bright, abnormal readings on the wall ahead, an unusual heat signature that contrasted sharply with the surrounding cold. "There's something behind that wall," he said. "A heat source. But it's not making sense. It's way too warm for this place." The wall Jake pointed to was partially collapsed, exposing layers of crumbling plaster and rusted steel. Ben hesitated, eyeing the unstable structure. "You're not seriously thinking about going through there, are you?" he asked nervously. Ashley ignored him, stepping closer. She ran her hand along the wall, feeling a faint draft of air seeping through the cracks. "There's definitely something back there," she said. "Help me clear it." Help me? Clarence said. An actress's mood tension is beyond today. Reluctantly, Jake and Ben joined her. Using a combination of brute force and improvised tools, they managed to pry away enough debris to create a small opening. Dust filled the air, and the group coughed as they peered into the darkness beyond. The beam of Ashley's flashlight revealed a narrow passage that seemed untouched by time. Unlike the rest of the asylum, this area was eerily preserved, as though sealed off intentionally. "This is it," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "The source of the energy I've been feeling. It's been hiding here all along." The group stepped cautiously into the hidden wing, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. The air was suffused with the metallic tang, and the temperature dropped sharply, sending chills down their spines. Cells lined the narrow hallway, each one containing remnants of its grim past. Chains hung from the walls, some with manacles still attached. Scratch marks marred the plaster, desperate and jagged, as though someone had clawed at the walls in a futile attempt to escape. You get it. Jake scanned the area with his thermal camera. The abnormal heat readings were gone, replaced by a disconcerting cold that the equipment struggled to register. "Why would they seal this off?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ashley shook her head, shining her flashlight into one of the cells. Inside, a rusted cot and a tattered straitjacket told a silent story of suffering. Clara's breathing grew uneven. She clutched her head, her eyes darting around as though she could see what the others couldn't. "They were left here to die," she murmured. "Abandoned, forgotten, but they never left." As the group ventured deeper into the wing, the asylum seemed to come alive with malevolent energy. Doors that had been ajar slammed shut with deafening force, echoing through the hallways. "Did you see that?" Jake exclaimed, pointing his camera toward a cell door that had just slammed shut. The footage showed nothing unusual, but the sound was undeniable. Ben jumped as his flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light. "This place is messing with us," he said, his voice trembling. We need to get out of here. The whispered voices that had been faint earlier now grew louder, overlapping in chaotic waves. They seemed to emanate from all directions, surrounding the group in a cacophony of unintelligible sounds. And, I'm pretty certain I have herpes. Alice smiled and looked down. Ashley spun around, her flashlight darting across the walls. Is anyone else hearing this? She asked, though the panicked expressions on her teammates' faces confirmed they were. Clara froze, her eyes widening in terror. It's them, she whispered. They're angry we're here. At the end of the hallway, the group stumbled upon a heavy metal door. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. They hesitated, the oppressive energy almost unbearable, but curiosity pushed them forward. Inside, they found an operating room eerily preserved like the one they had encountered earlier. This one, however, bore signs of violence. The operating table was tipped over, and the tools were scattered across the floor, stained with what looked like dried blood. Ashley knelt to examine a file folder on the floor. It contained handwritten notes detailing experiments on patients, procedures that were cruel and inhumane. Here's my wallet. This wasn't treatment, she said, her voice shaking. This was torture. Clara gasped, clutching her chest. Her face turned pale as she whispered, "They're here." The temperature in the room plummeted, and the whispers grew deafening. The group huddled together as the room filled with a suffocating presence. Shadows flickered along the walls, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for them. Blake said, "I do my best to societal sanity, then sleep at night." Jake's equipment began to malfunction again, emitting high-pitched screeches that made everyone wince. Ben's flashlight died completely, plunging him into darkness. "We need to leave. Now," Clara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. As they turned to flee, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The whispers turned into screams, a chorus of agony that seemed to reverberate within their very bones. Ashley banged on the door, desperate to escape, while Jake fiddled with his equipment, trying to capture the phenomena. Clara collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "They want us to feel their pain," she said, her voice broken. "They want us to suffer like they did." The group's survival instincts kicked in as they scrambled to find a way out. Jake managed to force the door open with a loud creak, and they bolted down the hallway, the malevolent presence hot on their heels. The asylum seemed to twist and shift around them, the walls narrowing and the hallways stretching endlessly. Shadows chased them, their grotesque forms growing larger and more menacing. Artificial walls, Finally, they burst through the opening they had created earlier, collapsing onto the ground outside. The asylum loomed behind them, silent and unyielding. As they caught their breath, Jake reviewed the footage on his camera. The images were distorted, filled with static and shadowy figures. "We have to go back," Ashley said, her voice trembling but determined. Clara shook her head vehemently. "No, this place isn't just haunted. It's alive. If we go back, we won't leave again." The group sat in silence, the weight of their experience pressing down on them. St. Augustine Asylum had revealed its darkest secrets, and its vengeful spirits would remain a haunting memory they could never escape. The hidden wing exuded a sense of finality, as though the team had reached the heart of the asylum's dark history. The air was heavier here, each breath a struggle. Ashley, Jake, Clara, and Ben advanced cautiously, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust that had settled over decades. It was in this eerie silence that they stumbled upon the truth. As they moved further into the wing, Ben's flashlight beam illuminated a desk shoved into a corner. Papers and books were scattered across its surface, as if someone had left in a hurry. "What's this?" Ben asked, picking up a worn, leather-bound journal. The name Dr. Albright was scrawled in faded ink on the cover. Ashley took the journal and began to flip through its brittle pages. Each entry painted a horrifying picture of Dr. Albright's so-called treatments. "Listen to this," Ashley said, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "Patient 27 exhibited unusual resilience to lobotomy, prompting further experimentation with electroshock therapy, administered at 3 times the standard voltage." Jake winced. "That's not medicine, that's torture." The journal chronicled unspeakable horrors. Patients subjected to inhumane experiments, denied food and water, and left to rot in their cells. One entry detailed an experimental surgery that involved removing parts of a patient's brain while they were still conscious. "He thought he was a pioneer," Ashley said, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. But he was a monster." The group's search led them to a dusty storage room filled with outdated medical equipment and files. At the back of the room, Jake spotted an old film projector, its reels coated in grime. "Think this thing still works?" Jake asked, wiping dust off the lens. Clara hesitated, her face pale. "Whatever's on there, I don't think we want to see it." Ignoring her warning, Jake set up the projector. The film sputtered to life, projecting a shaky black and white image onto the cracked wall. The grainy footage showed Dr. Albright in an operating room, his face obscured by a surgical mask. Surrounding him were frightened patients, restrained and screaming. The doctor appeared unfazed, his movements methodical as he performed a procedure on a conscious patient. The screams were haunting, even through the poor audio quality of the recording. The doctor's cold demeanor was chilling, his eyes devoid of empathy. "Turn it off," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake hesitated but complied, the projector clicking off with a jarring finality. The room plunged back into silence, save for the group's ragged breathing. "Now we know why this place feels so wrong," Ashley said. "It's soaked in suffering." As the group tried to process what they had just witnessed, Clara suddenly staggered backward, clutching her head. "Clara!" Ashley exclaimed, rushing to her side. Clara's eyes were wide and unfocused, her breathing shallow. "He's here," she murmured. "He's never left." "Really?" She flapped her arms excitedly. Sometimes the temperature in the room plummeted, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the wing. Clara's body stiffened, and she began to speak in a voice that wasn't her own. "He promised to heal us, but he only brought pain. We begged for mercy, but he laughed. He must be stopped." The words sent chills through the group. Clara's head snapped toward the far wall, her gaze fixed on something invisible to the others. "And he's still practicing," she said, her voice breaking. "On anyone who enters. He feeds on their fear, their agony, and he's not done with us." Baltimore said. "What?" Julian asked. The oppressive energy in the room intensified, pressing down on the group like a physical weight. Clara collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. We have to leave," she said, her own voice returning. "If we stay, he'll trap us here, just like the others." As Clara's warning echoed in their minds, the group felt an overwhelming presence. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming the indistinct figure of a man. Though his features were blurred, his aura radiated malice. Then the woman said, "Are you here also to inspire women boys to love fighting back?" "Who dares disturb my work?" a voice boomed, shaking the walls. The group backed away, their flashlights flickering wildly. The figure stepped closer, his form solidifying into that of a man in a blood-stained lab coat. His cold, lifeless eyes bore into them, filled with a twisted sense of purpose. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Now, you're mine." The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the group was paralyzed by an unseen force. Clara, trembling, raised her hand. "You're done, Albright," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Your victims demand justice." The spirit snarled, his form flickering as though caught between dimensions. The voices of the asylum's victims rose in a deafening chorus, drowning out his protests. I was an addict, and my habit was ridiculous, he said at last. Let him come. The group fled the hidden wing, their steps guided by Clara's desperate pleas to follow her. They burst out into the main hallway, the oppressive energy diminishing as they left the hidden area behind. Once outside, they collapsed onto the ground, their bodies trembling from the ordeal. The asylum loomed behind them, silent and foreboding. Oh, wait! Tricky settled back into the hole of the asylum. Ashley looked at the journal in her hands, its pages containing evidence of unspeakable crimes. We have to make sure people know, she said. No one else should come here. Yeah. Clara nodded, though her expression was haunted. He's not gone, she said, but he's weaker now. The truth, his undoing. As the group drove away, the asylum seemed to fade into the fog, its secrets retreating into the shadows. But they knew it wasn't over. St. Augustine Asylum and its vengeful spirits would remain a dark stain on their memories, a chilling reminder of the evil that had once thrived there. End of Chapter 1. The air grew colder as the team entered the operating room, their flashlights casting long, wavering shadows on the cracked tiles. A rusted operating table stood at the center, its surface stained with dark patches that looked disturbingly fresh. Instruments, scalpels, saws, and forceps were neatly arranged, as if waiting for the next procedure. I don't like this, Jake muttered, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. Clara stood frozen near the door, her eyes wide. He's here, she whispered. He's watching us. Without warning, the door slammed shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the room. The temperature plummeted, and a low, guttural laugh echoed from the walls. The group huddled together, their breaths visible in the frigid air. A dark figure began to materialize near the operating table. You've come to observe my work, the figure said, its voice deep and menacing. You'll soon see. Perfection requires sacrifice. The figure solidified into the ghostly form of Dr. Albright. His eyes glowed with a sinister light, and his blood-stained coat swayed as if caught in an unseen wind. Ashley stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. You're nothing but a murderer. Your victims deserve peace, not this endless torment. The doctor's smile twisted into a snarl. Peace. They are my experiments, my legacy. And now, so are you. As the doctor spoke, the room erupted into chaos. Instruments flew through the air, narrowly missing the team. The walls began to seep dark red liquid that trickled down in ominous rivulets. We have to get out of here, Ben shouted, dodging a scalpel that embedded itself in the wall beside him. Jake's equipment sparked and fizzed, the devices overloaded by the intense paranormal activity. His camera captured fleeting images of shadowy figures, former patients, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Suddenly, the group was separated by an unseen force. Ashley and Jake were thrown against one wall, while Ben and Clara were pushed toward another, somehow managed to get themselves in place safely during the impact of a horrible explosion, making them unable to do moves. Stay together, Ashley yelled, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of screams and crashing objects. The team regrouped and made a break for the door, but the asylum seemed to have other plans. The walls shifted, stretching and twisting into endless hallways. Doors led to nowhere, and each turn brought them back to the same blood-streaked operating room. It's like the building doesn't want us to leave, Jake said, his voice tinged with panic. Clara stood still, her face pale but resolute. It's him, she said. He's controlling everything. We can't escape unless we weaken him. Ashley turned to Clara, desperation in her eyes. How? How do we stop a ghost? Clara's gaze softened, and tears welled up in her eyes. He's tied to this place, to the pain he caused. If I confront him, I might be able to distract him long enough for you to get out. No, Ashley said, shaking her head. We leave Together, we'll find another way. Clara smiled sadly. There's no other way. He's too strong, but I can feel the spirits of his victims. They're waiting for someone to stand up to him. They'll help me. Before anyone could stop her, Clara stepped toward the ghostly figure of Dr. Albright. Her body seemed to glow, faintly, as she closed her eyes and murmured words of comfort to the spirits trapped in the asylum. I haven't stopped eating or sleeping at night desperately searching for answers, and finally found one. The doctor turned to her, his expression darkening. What do you think you're doing? He hissed. Deep in his voice was an undercurrent of chaos. Clara opened her eyes, now filled with a fierce light. Your time is over. You have no power over them anymore. The spirits of the doctor's victims began to appear, their translucent forms surrounding him. Their faces, once filled with fear and anguish, now radiated determination. The doctor roared, his form flickering as the spirits advanced. No! I created you! You owe me your lives! Clara turned to the team one last time. Go, she said. I'll hold him here. Make sure the world knows what happened in this place. Tears streaming down their faces, the team hesitated, but Clara's voice rose above the chaos. Go! Now! As the group fled, the asylum seemed to fight their escape. Doors slammed shut in their faces, and the floor buckled beneath their feet. Jake used his last functioning thermal sensor to guide them, following the faint warmth of an exit. Finally, they landed on a hallway that took them to an exit. When the sensor cut off, he turned to Jake. Behind them, Clara's voice echoed, mingling with the enraged cries of the doctor and the rising chants of the liberated spirits. Finally, they burst through the front doors, stumbling into the cold night air. The asylum loomed behind them, its windows glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Ashley turned back, clutching the journal they had found. She did it, she said, her voice trembling. She freed them. The team stood in silence, their hearts heavy with grief for Clara's sacrifice. But they knew her bravery had brought an end to the doctor's reign of terror. As they drove away, the asylum seemed to shrink into the darkness, its power fading. But they knew they could never forget what they had witnessed, and they vowed to honor Clara's memory by ensuring the world knew the truth about St. Augustine Asylum. As the team stumbled out of the decaying asylum, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The distant sound of crumbling walls and shifting floors echoed from within, a final desperate gasp from the tortured building. Jake's camera flickered one last time, capturing a single image before it died. Clara's faint silhouette, standing in one of the broken windows, surrounded by the shimmering, ghostly figures of the victims she had freed. She's still there, Ben whispered, his voice trembling as he stared back at the asylum. His heart clenched, unsure whether it was the spirit of Clara or just the asylum itself trying to hold them within its walls. Ashley clutched her stomach, feeling a mix of nausea and sorrow. She had led the team into the depths of the asylum, and now they had lost Clara? Forever. We have to keep going. We can't stay here, she urged, her voice hoarse. Ben nodded, but his eyes were locked on the asylum. I can't believe she's gone, he said. Jake, always the skeptic, was visibly shaken. His camera equipment, now useless, hung limply by his side. The sense of dread that had gripped him earlier had now been replaced by something heavier. Guilt. He had always prided himself on his technical expertise, but none of his gadgets had been able to save Clara. We need to leave before it all falls apart, he said, pulling Ben along by the arm. Together they hurried to the car, driving away from the decaying structure that had held them captive. But as the distance between them and the asylum grew, the overwhelming sense of grief and helplessness never left. The night air outside was still, eerily quiet, but it didn't bring any sense of relief. The terror they had witnessed lingered in their minds, following them as if the asylum itself had infected their very souls. Wait. Days later, the team regrouped at their base of operations, a small rundown studio they had used to film their ghost hunting show. Ashley sat at the desk, flipping through the pages of the journal they had recovered from Dr. Albright's hidden office. Her fingers hovered over the pages, but she couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting back to Clara, her sacrifice, the pain they had all endured. "We should have done more," she muttered to herself. Jake sat across from her, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. He tried to review the footage they had captured, hoping to find something, anything that could explain what had happened. But when he uploaded the files, the result was far worse than he had feared. The footage was corrupted. There were only brief, fragmented clips, distorted by the immense energy they had encountered in the asylum. What remained were flickering glimpses of the terrifying scenes they had witnessed. The operating room, Clara's final stand, and most haunting of all, the silhouette of Dr. Albright, his ghostly figure twisting in the shadows. But Clara's image had vanished, wiped from the memory of the camera. "It's gone," Jake said in disbelief, staring at the screen. "The only thing that survived was her silhouette, and I'm not even sure that's real." Ben, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room, spoke up. "Do you think she's still out there?" His voice was small, fragile. Ashley sighed, rubbing her eyes. "I don't know, Ben. I hope she's at peace. But part of me feels like she's still with us." The weight of their loss hung heavily in the air. They had entered St. Augustine Asylum looking for proof of the supernatural, but what they found was far worse than they had ever imagined. It was a journey that had changed them. End quote. Forever. As of April 2015, the most recent victim to die was 23-year-old Samuel Holt Sawyer. Another foundation is founded by none other than the head of the Department of Mental Health Physicians of the asylum, the werewolf physician, Leo Schindelberg, ELFANDUEB. Over the following weeks, the team tried to move on, but it became impossible to escape the feeling of the asylum's presence. No matter where they went, they felt like they were being watched, haunted by the spirits they had disturbed. Their once thriving paranormal show lost its appeal as the team members struggled to cope with their trauma. Jake, who had always been the technical brain of the group, became obsessed with the footage. He constantly tried to repair the corrupted files, but every attempt failed. The once constant hum of his equipment now sat idle, a constant reminder of their unfinished mission. Ben couldn't shake the image of Clara's face, her expression one of resolve and peace in the final moments. He'd tried to reach out to the other members of the team, but each time he spoke about it, he was met with silence. Their shared trauma had pushed them to the brink of breaking apart. Ashley made the difficult decision to disband the team. Their once solid bond had been shattered by the horrors they had faced, and no amount of time or therapy seemed to bring them back together. She couldn't continue in good conscience, not after Clara had given her life to stop Dr. Albright. In the psychologists, as the team members parted ways, each of them carried a piece of the asylum with them. They couldn't forget the dark presence that still loomed in their memories, the questions that had once driven them about the nature of the paranormal, the darkness of human souls, and the spirits left behind remained unanswered. Oh yeah, sorry, we didn't realize the bedding was for us sisters. So the Ghost Riders are a group of 14 members. In the years that followed, Ashley, Jake, and Ben would each continue their lives, but none of them could ever fully escape the shadow of St. Augustine Asylum. The footage they had captured, the terrifying screams of the patients, and the vengeful ghost of Dr. Albright continued to haunt their dreams. But perhaps the most troubling thing of all was the question that never seemed to fade. Had Clara really managed to free the spirits of the asylum? Or had she simply become another trapped soul in the eternal nightmare? Would they ever find out, or had they left something behind, something unfinished, that would one day pull them back to St. Augustine Asylum? Years passed, and the legend of St. Augustine Asylum faded into whispers, buried beneath new mysteries. The asylum had long been abandoned, its dark past becoming a mere rumor among thrill-seeking adventurers. But as time wore on, the pull of its haunted halls proved too strong for one new group of urban explorers. Moving that out in the spoiler warning, I think we kind of missed that in the very first post. A team of young, eager explorers, armed with cameras and a thirst for thrills, ventured into the asylum, unaware of the horrors that awaited. They entered the crumbling gates, their voices echoing in the eerie silence as they laughed nervously, unaware of the malevolent force lingering just beyond the veil. As they moved deeper into the asylum, the team discovered the same decayed hallways, broken equipment, and faded patient records. They felt an overwhelming sense of unease, but pressed on, determined to capture footage of the unseen world. The camera's infrared lens scanned the dark corridors, catching fleeting shadows, whispers, and cold spots that seemed to pulse with energy. It wasn't until they reached the operating room, the very room where the original team had faced their terror, that the atmosphere grew unbearable. In the final moments, the camera panned across the room, capturing a haunting sight. Among the shadows of tortured souls stood a new, familiar figure. Clara. Her once warm face was now pale, her expression frozen in a silent scream, her form indistinguishable from the other restless spirits. Her mother's body was being pierced in the waist by both daggers and a rod. As the camera flickered, a chill filled the air. The explorers turned, their screams fading as the building seemed to close in on them, sealing them in its eternal nightmare. The asylum's dark legacy lived on, and Clara was now part of its cursed inhabitants, forever bound to its cruel history. Friends, this story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. The locations, characters, and events depicted are not real. Any resemblance to actual places, persons, or events is purely coincidental. The intent of this story is not to offend anyone's sentiments or promote superstition. Please regard it as a work of fiction. If you enjoyed this story and want more thrilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more spine-chilling content.